Hi everyone. In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another pawn endgame, and this is mainly going to be focusing on the queen versus pawn endgames. So in this first puzzle, we see that white has a queen and black has a pawn. So how is white going to win this position? Well, you can't just play a random move and hope to just win the game like that. You have to actually use a bit of strategy in this case. And the strategy that we're going to use is simply checking the king and bringing your queen closer to preventing the pawn from promoting. The queen will come closer, and eventually when the king blocks the pawn's promotion square, that's when you bring your own king, and you're going to use that to your advantage. So let's see how this works. White goes queen c7 check, king to b1. Black does not want to play king to d1 because that would allow white to then bring the king into the game, let's say king to d7. So instead of going king to d1, black will play king to b1. Now white continues checking, and you have to notice that when you check, you bring your queen down a different rank each time. So when the queen goes to b6, this is more important than going to b7 or b8 because now your queen is coming closer, and then with the assistance of the king, you can later try winning the pawn. So king c2, queen c5 check, king to b1, and here white has two choices to actually go for. One of them is just continue checking on b4, bring your queen closer. Another one is also fine, this is queen d4, and it's pretty much the same thing, you're bringing your queen closer. And you just want to make sure that that pawn cannot promote at the moment because it's either a check or because if your opponent promotes, you're just going to capture and there's no defender there. So queen b4 check, king c2, the queen now comes to c4 check because obviously you can't go any further down the ranks. So king to b2 and now queen to d3. And after queen to d3 is played, you cannot push the pawn, obviously, so you must assist it and try to help it queening. Of course, if you don't make any other sensible moves, like if you play something like king to a1, then obviously white's going to capture the pawn, and that's basically it. So king c1 is forced, but now white has queen c3 check. And here, this is the problem that black faces. Black can either move the king to b1 and give up the pawn, and then it's going to be a king and queen checkmate, or they can continue to hold on by playing king to d1. But now, because the pawn cannot be advanced any further, now white will bring the king into the game. So king c7, and now king to e2. The king obviously needs to have the pawn promote, and that's the only chance that black has of really the position becoming a draw. So king to e2, now black is threatening d1 queen. But white stops black just in time with queen to c2. Another move can also be queen to e5 check, just checking the king and forcing it to go onto an unfavorable square, but queen c2 is also completely fine. The king goes to e1, and now you play queen e4 check. You don't go queen b1 check because then the pawn will promote. So queen e4 check, king f2, and now queen to d3. So you only have one move as black, and that's to go to e1, but now queen to e3 check, king goes to d1, and now you bring the king down to c6, or to d6, it doesn't really matter. You just need to be able to bring your king and help prevent the advancement of the pawn. And the algorithm can simply be repeated. And after you continuously bring your king closer, and with the assistance of the queen, also being able to prevent the pawn from queening, you are going to win the game as white. Let's look at another example. In this next position, we see that white is actually going to still play with the queen against black having the pawn. The only problem in this case now is that this is actually a draw, and there's nothing that white can do about it. The problem really lies within the fact that white's king is too far away to assist the defense of the pawn from queening. And another factor that you have to take into consideration is that the pawns on the A file are another reason why this is actually a draw instead of a win for white. And to illustrate why, we first have to look at what happens if the pawns are not there. So if we were to remove the pawns, and we have the same position, this is actually a win for white. Because white is just going to use the same mechanism as before. Go queen a5 check, and after, say, king b3 to not block the pawn from queening, you go queen b5 check, and now let's say you go king c2, queen c4 check, and then after king d2, queen b3, king c1, queen c3, king b1, and then the king simply approaches. That's all normal. However, the only problem is that there are two pawns on a4 and on a5. So it becomes nearly impossible to execute the same plan that would have been possible in this case, because when you look at this position now, the only way you can actually stop the pawn from queening is to go queen c2, queen d2, which both moves pin the pawn to the king, and the other move is queen c4 check, which is a useless check that doesn't really achieve much. Because when you check on c4, after king to a1, you have no follow-up checks, and this is the problem. Because now, how are you going to check and also prevent black from queening? Okay, yes, you can play queen c3, queen d4, something like that to just pin the pawn from moving, but after the king gets out of this pin, what are you going to do next? And if you try doing it this way with queen c2, just king a1. If you pin, black will just go to a2, and the threat comes back. So this is what you have to take into consideration when you play a queen versus pawn endgame. And another thing is that if this were to occur where you go queen c2, and now after, say, king a1, you bring your king out to e7, b1 queen, queen takes b1, king takes b1, king d6, king c2, king c5, king d3, king b5, all of this, king d4, and now you take the pawn on a5. Unfortunately, after this entire 7-move combination, black has the move king c5 and is able to hold the position to a draw. Because the opposition works in black's favor, and if you go king a6, then king c6, king a7, king c7. Just repeat where white is going. And then if you even try to push the pawn, it's not really going to be of much use, because after king c6, a6, king c7, king a8, you can just simply play the move king c8, and if you're going to advance the pawn now, it's actually stalemate after king c7. And you see what I'm trying to tell you. It doesn't matter if that king can actually win the pawn and get an extra pawn, a passed pawn, that too. It only matters if the king is close enough to be able to capture the pawn with an extra tempo, which can also help it essentially be able to escort the pawn down the board quick enough before the enemy king can stop it. So we saw this position, but now let's look at the same position where white has the king on f7. Now if we see this exact same position, we've only changed one thing, and that's the square that the king is on. And we can see how this one minute difference can change the entire result of the game. So queen c2, we repeat the pattern. So you go queen c2 and king a1, and then you bring your king to try to capture the pawn and at least get your passed pawn to victory. So king to e6, you don't need to waste your time by going queen c3 and trying to prevent the pawn from queening, because inevitably the pawn will queen, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So king to e6, b1 queen, and now the trade of queens occurs. The king comes to d5, and the king is closer to the pawn. King c2, and you play king c4. This is a technique called shouldering, where you essentially do not allow your enemy's king to come near the pawn. And after king c4, king d2, king b5, how are you going to defend this as black? The best you could try is king c3, but after king takes a5, king c4, there's king b6, and there's no way to stop this pawn from essentially marching down the board and bringing a queen. So, what can you do after queen c2? Really nothing, and this just proves how one little difference in the position can just change the entire dynamic of the game. We notice that in this position, black has a bishop pawn, and it's on the verge of queening. White is able to prevent black from queening, but this is going to end in another type of draw. And let's see if you can guess what it is. So, in this case, white is going to go queen b4 check, because obviously they want to bring their king closer to the pawn and essentially stop it from queening. The king goes to a2, and now queen to c3. We repeat that same pattern. King to b1, queen b3 check, and it all seems to be going fine here. It all seems like everything's working out, and this is going to be a win for white. But this is where black plays the very incredible move that actually draws the game. So if you were playing as black in this position, which side would you move to? Would you go to a1, or would you go to c1? The correct answer is to go to the a1 square, because now white cannot take the pawn on c2 because it's going to be stalemate. This is the way to draw that I was trying to hint earlier. And when queen takes c2 is played, it's just a very brilliant position. Black has managed to stalemate himself, even though white is essentially up a lot of material. So white's not going to take the pawn. They're going to go queen e3, king b1. So they're going to repeat the pattern. King b1, and then they want white to go queen b3 check, in which they're going to play king a1 again. But this is also going to end up into a similar variation. King b2, queen e2, and what does black play? King to a1. Black's not going to acknowledge the threat of queen takes c2 that white has, because it's not exactly a threat. It's only going to help black draw the game a lot quicker. So, now if we try to look at this exact same position, but instead of the king being on b2, we're going to move the king over to d2. And let's see how this exact same technique will work in this case. So when we change this position, unfortunately for black, it's actually going to be a loss. And why is that? Well, it's because black needs to be on the a1 square in order for the stalemate to actually occur. However, the king is on d2, and it's going to need to pass by c1 to go to the a1 square. But unfortunately, the c1 square will block the pawn from queening, and this will also mean that black is going to have to allow the white king to inch closer, and this is going to be the problem. So in this case, we're going to see the move queen to d4 check, the king goes to e2, and now you play queen c3, and after king d1, queen to d3 check, king c1, and now the king comes over to c4. This is all pretty normal. King to b2, queen to d2, so you pin the pawn, and now black might just say, oh, well, there's king to b1, and I found a way to draw. Well, that's not the case, because white actually has the very nice king to b3 move. And unfortunately for black, they are completely lost, because if black promotes the pawn to a queen, then there's simply going to be queen to a2, and this is an unfortunate checkmate that black has gotten themselves into. Now, with that being said, of course, you do not need to promote to a queen. You could even under-promote to other pieces, such as a knight, to give a check, but it's going to have the same result, since under-promoting to a knight won't really help the matter at hand. In fact, it's only just going to result in checkmate just 2 moves later. And that's the reason why some of these positions actually have flaws. Because in the knight and center pawn positions, there's a chance that you actually are going to be able to get a draw if you are the side that has a pawn. And that is because there's a small % chance that white is actually going to be standing in front of the square, which will prevent the white queen from actually checking the black king. So there are some loopholes to these types of different principles of endgame theory, but overall the general idea is that a bishop or rook pawn is going to be a draw against a queen endgame, and a knight or center pawn is going to be a win for the side with the queen in the queen and pawn endgame. So now that we've seen how this works, we're going to be looking at one final position with a rook pawn endgame. In this final position, we see that black is trying to queen their pawn, and we also notice that it's a rook pawn, and it most likely will be the same position that occurred in the bishop pawn endgame. So in this specific case, we notice that black is about to queen, and white must stop it quickly. So white will go queen b3 check. And black is going to now play the move king to a1, because king c1 is not going to put the king in the corner, and after white takes the pawn, it's just going to be a win instead of stalemate. So king to a1. And if white moves the king anywhere on the board, it's going to be a draw by stalemate. And if white is not going to allow the black king to have any square, then it's still going to be stalemate. So white goes queen to d1 check. And after king to b2, queen to d2 check. King to b1. And now try to find the winning move in this position. That's right, I said winning move. Okay, so the winning move is actually king to b4, and even though it may seem like this move doesn't grant white anything, it actually does, because after king to b4 is played, black is obviously going to promote the pawn, because you can't go king to a1, as that'll result in the very nice queen c1 checkmate. So instead, you're obviously going to see a1 queen, and now king to b3. And the only time where the rook slash bishop pawn endgame technique is not going to work is when the king is close enough to do something like this. White goes king b3, and essentially there's no way to prevent the idea of queen to c2 mate without giving up a lot of material. And even then, it's still going to end up in checkmate. And the same idea can also be formed from a different position. And we can see that if we had put the king on e4 instead of b5 as well. So if we had done this, it would have worked as well, because white would go queen b3 check, black would play king a1, white would go queen c3 check, king b1, so just a repetition of moves, king to d3, and a1 queen would unfortunately be met with the very devastating queen c2 checkmate from white's end. And the point is that these endgame positions may have a different result than what is said to most likely happen. But about 9 out of 10 games will end in the expected result, and that one little game is going to change the result. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.